Yourself! Uh-oh.
Oh, Serious Sam, perhaps the most serious of all retro shooters, debuting with the first encounter developed by Crow Team in 2001. This game made waves for its high-energy gameplay and stunning sun-bleached graphics. Just a bit more than 20 years after the first encounter had came out, the game has been updated with a path-traced renderer. A developer by the name of sultim-t, or sultim-t, has released an updated version of the original Serious engine on GitHub that all owners of the game can download and utilize for free. In today's video on Digital Foundry, I will detail the ins and outs of this path-traced renderer, describing some of the cool features it adds, and comparing to the original 2001 release while doing so. I will also touch on how it performs and what you need to look out for. So as the man himself says,
let's get serious!
Before I get into the nitty-gritty here of the visuals, let me get some of the basics out of the way. This Serious Sam RT fork on GitHub is based on Vulkan and modifies the original Serious engine from 2001 and not the Serious Sam HD engine from 2009. This means it will not have all those nice high-poly models and materials from Serious Sam HD, as it is modifying the original game and is going to be bound by the limitations of that 2001 release largely. With that in mind, though, a large effort has been made to make the path tracing work at all with that original release's artwork, which meant remaking a lot of textures. For path tracing to work, and for light to propagate around the scene, textures need things like normal maps and materials. So the author of the path tracer here has gone in and tweaked all of the game's textures to have these characteristics. For example, that teleporter pad in the game's first level, which originally was just a diffused texture that was trying to look like metal, well, that now has a normal map and a material property to make it reflect the surroundings and look a lot more like metal. Similarly, the weapon models found in the game world, or the models in your character hands, have metal bits on them that pick up environmental reflections and light. For those objects, the original tried to emulate the look of metal reflections, like the Ankh key here, which used this texture effect found in other games like Half-Life to make the Ankh look like there's a reflection on its surface. In the path traced renderer, it actually has a metallic material that has path traced reflections on it. Adding materials into the engine must have been a really large undertaking, and all the metal materials managed to wonderfully stay within the game's original art style. For dull surfaces like rocks or stones, normal maps have been added in to make the new lighting apply to them better. Like here in this scene. In the original game, this area is primarily lit in an indirect way with baked light maps. The textures in games from this era rarely had normal maps though, so the light in the shadowed regions away from the sun looks flat and diffuse. In the new version of that scene, it's possible to see how the stone tiles on the floor have a lighting direction applied to them, where the beveled side of the tile facing the entrance is lighter, and the side away from the entrance is darker, giving the floor a more 3D look to it, although it is just, of course, a 2D texture. Such an aspect was necessary to make this path tracer work at all in a consistent manner. The texture upgrade does not stop there though, as nearly every texture has also had its resolution upgraded many times over. Now I'm not sure how this was done, whether by AI or by hand, but the textures now look rather awesome. Take a look here at the sky texture. The texture in the path traced version is very true to the artwork of the original game, but at a much higher resolution, and this is nearly the case for every single texture in this release. The textures though are a sideshow. The actual star of the show here is the lighting that the textures enable, which bounces around scenes and the world geometry in the same fascinating ways like we saw in Quake 2 RTX. This global illumination makes the game look the way it does, and is best I think seen in areas hidden away from the sun, like here in the game's first level. Here the effects of global illumination bounce lighting really stand out. The sun lighting is just hitting the floor, and the pillars and the wall adjacent here casting thin direct sunlight and shadows into the gallery. But if you look at each of the pillars on the left here, it's possible to see how between the pillars, on the ceiling or the floor, there is actually bounce light there. And in those areas where the bounce light from the sun does not reach, like behind the pillars, there's a dark diffuse shadow that tapers out. A scene like this one looks surprisingly real, for such low detail geometry. Adding to this global illumination is light coming from the sky, so skylight, like here in this shot where the opening in the roof casts subtle bluish light from the blue sky above into the scene below, creating soft ambient shadows underneath everything. This is something that the developers of the original game tried to fake in a manner with the game's light map maker, but that leaves very distinct sharp shadows. This global illumination works for more than just natural lights outdoors, and in fact it works for every single light in the game, including man-made ones. This is a key way the path-traced version is lit, as the path-traced version of the game actually has a lot less lights than the original. Yes, the path-traced version has lights for things like torches, sconces, fire pits, the sun, and more, but for indoor scenes, things are quite different in the new version. In the original Serious Sam, many indoor scenes were lit with what are called unmotivated light sources. Unmotivated lights are those that don't have a real source, but instead come from nowhere, essentially, and do not line up with objects in the scene, like a torch. These added-in fake lights were used extensively in many of the game's indoor scenes, which gives these areas in Serious Sam, in the original, a rather flat look, as light is coming from everywhere, yet nowhere at the same time. The path-traced version of the engine eliminates these unmotivated lights, and instead, all these sections are only lit by things like torches and fire pits. This makes a lot of areas really dark, actually. This would be a problem, but the author of the path tracing engine added in a player flashlight like the one found in Serious Sam 3. So these sections of the game now have a different gameplay feel, as your flashlight can be the primary method of illumination for these long dormant pyramids and crypts. Like other lights, this flashlight contributes to global illumination, so its light bounces around this environment. Like you can see here, there's light bouncing around the scene outside of the direct cone of light from the flashlight. And as I move the flashlight from the dull surface of the wall to the white statue, for example, you can see how the entire room brightens up as the light bounces harshly off that white statue. Similarly, bounce light can create shadows of its own, like here, where the pillar on the right-hand side of the screen in this shot has its side facing to the cone of light lit up, but the side of the pillar facing away from that cone of light is casting shadow on the floor nearby. Along with the flashlight, there are other new light sources in the path traced renderer. Power-ups, for example, are now treated as light-emitting surfaces. In the original game, like in this scene here, this area is primarily uniformly lit by so-called unmotivated light sources, with only a few real light sources in the background from the torches. I think it looks a bit flat. In the path-traced version of that scene, all the unmotivated light sources are gone, which darkens the room. But now the heart power-up in the middle of that room is a surface emitting light itself, casting a reddened glow across the environment. I think it's a pretty neat way to add atmosphere to these areas. Another additional lighting source in the game now to lighten up these dark areas are those from muzzle flashes, where dynamic lighting flares with each bullet fired and explosion bang. So weapons like the minigun muzzle flash cast a dancing cascade of light and shadow around the environment, and green laser bolts do much of the same, and each rocket flares in a spectacular way as it flies and then detonates into the distance. This extra spectacle when firing weapons adds a little extra pizzazz to this game's gunplay, which I think is important, as Serious Sam from 2001 is not a game known for its amazing sound or weapon animation necessarily. One last area of the game where the visuals were transformed is for transparent surfaces like water. In the original game, water surfaces were kind of like those you might find in the original Unreal. Hyper blue textures that represent the surface and color of water with a moving texture on them, and then blue lights placed under the water surface and nearby to emphasize that watery look. The 2001 game even has animated caustic light textures in areas around water to make it look like there's caustic light bouncing off the water's ever-moving surface. In the path-traced version of the game, the water is now fully reflective, capturing the nearby environment and sky in its surface reflection. And when you look through the water at objects in the water or behind it, you can see the light refract in a realistic manner, like the health power-up under the water here. This distortion of light has also been added to the game's health vial pickups, where objects behind the vials of glass distort like in a funhouse mirror. Sadly though, the game does not support ray-traced caustics from water or from other transparent materials like we saw in Minecraft RTX. Instead, those same animated textures from the original game appear to be used here. And that's it for all the great upgrades this version of the game now has. There are some smaller additions, of course, that I did not mention, but the big point is that the path traced version of Serious Sam manages to capture the art style and lighting style of the original while greatly enhancing the detail and dynamism of the visuals. It's seriously cool. There are a lot of positives, but not everything is perfect, as we're talking about a real-time path tracer. For one, shiny materials like metal can have a great deal of grain in them in areas where there's low lighting conditions and complex light paths, so they can sparkle and speckle, and this will increase the lower the output resolution is. Maybe this is due to the way denoising is done, or the way lights are sampled. Another thing you might notice is that volumetric scattering phenomena that the original 2000 release faked are not present in the path traced engine. For example, in this scene here, the original game fakes volumetric lighting with this hand-placed piece of transparent geometry. It's crude, of course, and totally of that era, but it gets the point across that a beam of light is lighting up the dust in the air. The path tracer does not have such volumetric representation for its light transport, so it does not have that effect. Similarly, there's no fog in the game in the path traced renderer, so areas like this underwater shot from the original game fake the look of light extinction in the water with depth-based fog, and this is missing in the path traced version. And the last thing missing, as far as I can tell, are light flares. So that neat little lens flare you could get in the original game when looking at the sun is not present in the path trace game. Instead of light flares, the path trace game has a post-process bloom now. This bloom can really add to a lot of scenes, I think, but in general it is rather intense by default, which some players may not like. Should this much bloom be not your cup of tea, the options menu allows you to tune its intensity downward to your liking. Alongside adjusting bloom, there are other ways to tweak this game's graphics and performance, and tweaking the performance is going to be pretty necessary for some GPUs and CPUs out there. The first thing you need to look out for in this game is the VSync toggle. I do not recommend using the in-game VSync, as it tends to eat frames, even though your graphics card may be producing them, and Rivatuner statistics server may be reporting those frames as existing. Turning off VSync sets the game to use true triple buffering and does not seem to have this problem. Another graphical option to look for is the dynamic level of detail culling. This option removes objects from the BVH structure based upon distance and a variety of other factors. And since this is a path traced game, that means the objects will disappear at a distance. Like you can see here in this scene where the trees and other objects into the distance on the minimum setting are missing, while the higher settings maintain these objects. This setting has a rather high to moderate impact on GPU performance. On an RTX 3090 at 1440p, over the course of this full benchmark sequence, setting this setting to less from full improves performance by 15%, from full to low by 32%, and from full to minimum by 36% on average. In outdoor scenes, this doesn't actually have a big impact on visuals, but in indoor scenes, a setting of low or minimum will produce light sources popping in and out at times when rounding corners or entering a new room, and I find this a bit distracting, but it's still an important option for performance. For those with middle to low end ray tracing GPUs like the RTX 2080 or lower, I recommend low. For those with higher, I would usually recommend the less setting. But still, GPU is only one part of the equation here, and your CPU may not be up to the task for a higher setting. While using the Core i9-10900K, which is a real monster of a CPU, I was able to measure how this setting greatly impacts CPU performance. On the full setting, the Core i9-10900K is right on the cusp of 60 FPS, so many less powerful CPUs would probably be below 60 FPS on the full setting. The less setting fares a bit better, but I still imagine it could end up being a CPU bottleneck for some less than powerful CPUs, or when many enemies show up. In comparison, the low and minimum settings, though, offer up multiplicatively better performance, with low running nearly 5 times better than full, and minimum running nearly 12 times better. With this in mind, I say if you have a CPU with single core power performance of around Zen 2 or above, then you can try for that less setting. If your CPU is below that, or you want to try for FPS higher than 60, then you definitely want the low setting. Even with these optimization rules, many PCs will struggle to run this at high frame rates and high resolutions. The lowest end RTX 2060, for example, at optimized settings at 1080p, barely manages to hang on to 30 FPS with a very unsteady frame rate, and many dips below in the indoor areas when there's a lot of lights and enemies moving moving around. This low-end RT GPU can really only manage a very competent 60 FPS when running at 720p, but even then, it's obvious how there are some scenarios in this game where the GPU can get dangerously close to falling below 60 FPS. It's Serious Sam, it's a hectic game with a lot of explosions and stuff going off. On the high end, an RTX 3080 will generally have similar performance like that which we saw on the 2060 at 720p, but instead at 1440p and with the higher dynamic LOD setting. Here the RTX 3080 essentially is showing 4 times the pixel pushing power of the RTX 2060 with ray tracing. But like that GPU, it will also be right on the edge of going below 60 FPS at times, and might indeed be pushing the resolution slightly too high. With me showing the lowest end and some of the high end here, I think many users with NVIDIA cards can get an idea of which resolution they can target based upon this scale. Regarding AMD GPUs, I did try to run this game on an RX 6800 XT, but I could not get the game to boot. Reading online, it would appear that AMD GPUs might not be supported at the moment, but when they are, I think this could be an interesting test case for our benchmarks like Quake 2 RTXs. Getting to the end of this video, I'm rather amazed with this path traced version of Serious Sam the First Encounter. Yes, it's ultra heavy on the hardware like I just showed, but it looks awesome and it emphasizes my favorite aspects of the PC platform. There's that open nature of it, with this render being community sourced on GitHub from a fan, and it's also using cutting edge technology. Truly something as silly and as awesome as path traced Serious Sam could really only happen on the PC. But that's enough for me for now. If you did enjoy this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support Digital Foundry on Patreon to get years worth of our content available in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about path tracing and more, write a comment below and follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. As always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.